Shalom. Welcome to Lights of the Nations. We are studying Maimonides Laws of the Chosen House, Laws of the Holy Temple. You know, we have emphasized many times that when we study about the temple, it's not about a building, it's about the concept of Ratzah Kadosh Baruch Hu Dira B'Tachtonim, that God, the Holy One, blessed be He, sought to have an abode in this world, that He cares so much about this world, and all of the messages that broadcasts to the whole world, the very crux of what the message of Judaism is to the world, not only to Israel, but to the whole world, the fact that we're in this world, it's quite real, it's quite physical, it's quite tangible. We are not spiritual beings. We are physical beings, but we have the ability, through our connection to God, through our obedience to Him, through the commandments, through Torah study, through everything that we do, to elevate this world. It's really the message of the temple. So, you know, on that level, the Holy Temple is really not about the building. In other words, it's not about some sort of cult that is fixated on architecture, on an ancient building, like that this is so holy in of itself, it's a power spot. All that is true. The temple is built on the very seat, the reflection of Hashem's divine presence in this world. That is all true. And the Holy Temple, too, is very holy physically. The building of it itself, the structure, there are laws about the levels of sanctity on the temple. We're going to be learning about that soon in the following chapters of the Rambam, the ever-increasing levels of holiness in the temple. And that's all true. So there is a certain kind of mixture of two things that we need to keep in mind all the time. That it isn't only about the physical structure, it's about the spiritual essence of everything that it means to us. It's also, though, very much about the physical structure, in that the Torah is a book for all time. It is not a book, it's the eternal will of Hashem, and He gives us a plan, and He guides us as to how we can go about bringing about the best possible state of harmony for ourselves, for all humanity. But it's important for me once in a while to remember and to say out loud, as we're learning so much detail about the structure of the temple, that here it is, really, it's kind of ironic. Were we to only concentrate on the physical structure and never mention the fact that the physical structure is not even important if we don't understand what it is meant to bring about. So we would be totally amiss if we weren't to mention that. On the other hand, though, it's not like, you know, some other people have this idea that everything is totally abstract and everything's totally spiritual, and that there can't be anything of sanctity associated with the physical. That's also a perversion of the truth. The Torah teaches that there is this incredible dichotomy. There's this middle ground where they're so complementary, the physical and spiritual. I think we really see that from the temple and a Torah life for Jews and Gentiles. The temple is very physical. It's really, in that regard, the epitome of something physical. But the spiritual underpinnings is what it's all about. So we're learning so much detail about the temple, and we have to remember why. But obviously, it's quite precise, and this has come down to us, this legacy, for the purpose of rebuilding. So there's these 2 points, and I'll tell you exactly why I bring this up now. It's really very interesting. We are going to be finishing the 4th chapter of Beit HaBechira, possibly in today's lesson or perhaps in the next one. We have 5 halachot left in this chapter, and they're actually rather difficult. We'll see exactly how we're going to approach them. And these halachot have to do with the balconies around the side of the structure of the sanctuary, and what are called the cells of the sanctuary that we've spoken about, and the rooftop of the sanctuary itself, and the entrances from one cell to another. It's quite detailed, and Maimonides again has a very unique approach to some of these halachot, and it's based on his interpretation of a Mishnah that others disagree with, and he has a totally different idea of this structure, and so that he's totally opposed by many of the other commentators. And to tell you the honest truth, some of what Maimonides is going to be teaching about now in the coming halachot is very difficult to picture and to try to understand exactly what it is that he's talking about. And now the reason that I bring all of this up now is because I'm holding a different edition of the Rambam here. I consult with different publications as we are preparing our lesson. And here, this one, for example, relates to this whole issue of Maimonides' unique interpretation of the Mishnah in Masechet Midot, and how his opinion here is so different than everyone else's, and how difficult it is to understand, and we're not exactly sure what he meant. And listen to this, and you'll understand why I'm bringing this up now. And here is this comment at the end of chapter 4. After the commentators, contemporary commentators on this edition of Maimonides, expressing themselves about how difficult things are to understand, it says, "It is our prayer that the temple will be rebuilt in the near future, and then we will understand the Rambam's intent." I have to tell you that I find that very annoying. It is our prayer that the temple will be rebuilt, always putting it in third person somehow. In other words, no, that's the expression passive. Always putting it passively. It will be rebuilt, not we will rebuild it, somehow in the near future. And then we'll be able to go there and study it, and assuming that the temple will be rebuilt by whatever forces rebuild it, according to the interpretation of Maimonides, we'll understand what it is that he meant. And the reason that I find this so ironic is because we have to rebuild the temple, and in order to rebuild it, we have to know what Maimonides meant. And in other words, it's a different way of looking at things. And this is really interesting, and we've mentioned this concept before as well. When the deeper that we go in study about the temple, because what we're studying about is the blueprints of the rebuilding that's been given to us by our sages. When we refer to the Mishnayot and Masechet Midot, when we refer to the Rambam, we're referring to the eternal blueprint that's actually based on the temple scroll that we discussed so long ago in the beginning of our studies about the temple scroll, which was actually given at Sinai. And the deeper that we go into these different sources, ancient sources, straight from really the divine revelation, deeper that we go into these sources about the rebuilding of the temple, the more detail that we have, and sometimes we have very blatant contradictions between sources. Like, for example, as I mentioned to you, these 5 halachot are difficult to understand in the light of every other commentator. Maimonides has his own agenda here. But when you come to have to actually decide, to actually make a decision, one over the other, and to substantiate who is actually correct, the only way to do that is when physically you are actually laying out the plans. So if there is a controversy, for example, between sages about a certain space between the altar and the wall, and according to one opinion, this is the height or the width, and according to another, it's this, and then you start to build it, even if it's on paper or it's with the computer graphics that we're using today, and then all of a sudden you realize, once you really put it to practice, that one opinion doesn't work simply because physically it doesn't work. It leaves the realm of theory when you actually have to put it to the test, to practice. So I would prefer to say, instead of saying it is our prayer that the temple will be rebuilt in the near future, first of all, we like to put it this way. It is our prayer that we will merit to rebuild the temple, not that it will be rebuilt, because we realize that Hashem wants us to take an active role, and that we understand our studies. That's why we're studying now, for the purpose of being able to rebuild the temple. This commentary makes it sound like some sort of museum or some sort of teaching aid, that when the temple is built, the whole reason we should pray that the temple is rebuilt is so that we can go over to it and study very intently the walls and the width and the height and the length, so that we can tell what it is that Maimonides meant. We have to understand all of this now, and that's why we're studying so intently, so that we can rebuild the temple. So it's just a different way of looking at things, a different order, and that's what I really wanted to emphasize, and we must never forget or lose sight of what this is all about. It's quite real, and it's quite tangible, and it's also quite spiritual and quite abstract, and that's all this dichotomy of what it means to be alive in this world as a human being for Hashem, walking between these two different levels, between being physical beings and looking to uplift everything for the spiritual content and the intent. So, in chapter 4, in the 9th entry, Halacha Tesha, Maimonides tells us, "Ha'hechal haya binyano rachav milafanav v'tzar me'acharav kemo ari." As we've mentioned previously, we cited this idea. Maimonides tells us the structure of the temple was wide in the front and narrow in its rear like a lion. If you can picture the image of a lion crouching on its haunches, the front end of the lion is wider and then it tapers off towards the back. Actually, this is based on a verse in the prophets, and that verse calls Jerusalem by the nickname Ariel, which actually means lion. And the epitome of Jerusalem, the secret of that verse, is referring to the Holy Temple, the lion itself. And this is just on a simple level, goes back to that verse that we're pointing out, but actually on a spiritual level, on a more mystical, secret level, there are other reasons why it's compared to a lion. Now, we already mentioned this in Halacha 5, and we commented on it, the idea of the Rambam has a certain idea, a certain image of a trapezoid, of on the one hand, we've been mentioning that Maimonides' image of the building of the Heichal, the sanctuary, is basically a cube, but it's not exactly a perfect cube, and we've gone over the measurements, and it's somewhat trapezoidal in that it's slightly wider towards the front. Now, other commentaries don't have a problem with this idea of it being wider in the front and narrow in the rear, because they maintain that the ulam, the hall, the entrance hall, before the sanctuary is actually wider than the sanctuary. That's how they deal with that issue. Now, here the Maimonides begins to tell us this very kind of enigmatic idea, and as we mentioned, we're going to have here really raging controversy between many commentaries, and it's all based on the interpretation of several Mishnayot. Maimonides tells us as follows: "V'yitziyim hayu makifin labayat kulo misaviv chutz lakotel hamesiba." Begins to teach us this concept of what he refers to as balconies that extended, he says, from the wall of the winding stairwell and surrounded the temple on all sides. He calls these balconies, these yitzim, they're actually a type of protrusion which are coming out of the walls of the temple. And we're going to see that the opinion of Maimonides is that the walls of the temple on the west, on the south, on the north, and on the western sides were not smooth, they were not even, but they had these protrusions coming out. And it's basically a concept of kind of like a preventative measure that the Kohanim, who of course were very diligent and very careful and very much feeling all the time tremendous reverence for heaven, they should not forget themselves and become a little bit lax and lean against the wall of the temple. Not that they would be jauntily loitering around the temple, but there were these protrusions kind of coming out from the side which would prevent them from leaning. So, according to the Rambam, these balconies, these protrusions extended from the outermost wall of the temple on every side except the eastern side, in other words, the facade of the temple, when approaching from the courtyard, the eastern wall, the wall which is the entrance to the Heichal itself. And these balconies actually are mentioned in the book of Kings, Kings 1, and also in the Mishnayot of Tractate Midot. But again, the Rambam's conception of these structures is different than other commentaries, and therefore is the subject of much debate, and essentially they are being described by the Rambam as a protective measure, as we mentioned, to prevent a certain type of perhaps disrespect that would be shown to the temple. And this is also based on those verses in Kings where we're told that these structures, which are diminishing in size for the house, surrounding it on its exterior so that the people would not take hold of the house. So back to Maimonides again in Halacha 9, Hayechal haya b'ninyano rachav milfanav v'tzar mi'achorav kemo ari, yitziyim hayu makifin labayit kulo misaviv chutz lakotel hamasiba. These balconies extended from the wall of the winding stairwell and surrounded the temple on all sides. The winding stairwell is an expression called the Masiba, is actually a pathway located on the northern side of the entrance to the sanctuary. And within this passageway is a stairwell that ascends up to the top of the roofs of the compartments around the temple, from which access can be gained to the roof of the sanctuary itself, as we're going to be describing. So let me summarize some of this halacha in English. It's a bit difficult. We have here these structures, these protrusions, we'll call them balconies, ascending from bottom to top. The lowest balcony was 5 cubits long, and then there is a space in between this and the next balcony above it, and that space called roved, this pavement was 6 cubits long, and then the middle balcony or projection was 6 cubits, and the pavement above it was 7 cubits, and the upper balcony 7 cubits, and this again is based on Kings 1, chapter 6, verse 6, that tells us the lowest balcony. And thus we have 3 balconies that surrounded the temple from 3 sides. Again, not a balcony in terms of the way we would use the word to go out and stand on and take the air, but a kind of like a shelf extending from the side of the wall. So the Rambam continues and tells us that similarly there were projections from bottom to top around the wall of the entrance hall. In other words, we have stated that these protrusions, these balconies, were found on the walls of the temple, of the sanctuary, on the north, on the south, and on the west, but not on the east, which is the wall of the entrance hall. But there was also a certain pattern. There was a similar concept of the wall not being smooth. But, as Maimonides tells us, there was actually a pattern of 1 smooth cubit, and then a projection of 3 cubits, another smooth cubit, and then a projection of 3 cubits. A pattern followed from the bottom to the top of the wall, so that, and again, this is a unique interpretation. We see these diagrams and illustrations based on the interpretation of Maimonides. We see how he would envision the eastern wall of the sanctuary, and just as there is the concept of the protrusions along the other wall, so also there is the concept of the protrusions from the eastern wall. Now, in the next halacha, Maimonides tells us another very unique idea regarding a concept that we've been discussing until now, called the cells, the ta'im of the mikdash, of the temple. We mentioned this really when we were studying the 4th and 5th halacha, that Maimonides has a different conception of these cells than the other commentators. And there's a concept of these compartments that surrounded all around the edges of the building of the sanctuary, and the question of exactly where these cells were located and what their function was. And this is essentially based on the Mishnah. It is a Mishnah in the 4th chapter of Midot. And in fact, the language of Maimonides here in this particular halakha is very similar to the language of the Mishnah itself. So he tells us, Kol elu hamakomot hapnuyim sheben haktalim hem hanikraim ta'im. Maimonides' idea is that the vacant spaces between the walls are called cells. And if you recall, when we were studying about the walls of the sanctuary, we showed some illustrations and explained about the idea of Maimonides is that the walls that are described in the Mishnah are actually sets of walls. They're actually two walls in each instance other than the eastern wall, and therefore a space is created in between the walls. And according to Maimonides, the space created in between the walls are the ta'im, the cells, and as we're going to learn, they're actually multi-leveled. They're actually several floors of individual compartments. And these compartments are actually like rooms. They have entrances and exits. And Maimonides tells us again, all the vacant spaces between the walls are called cells. Thus, 5 cells surrounded the sanctuary on the north, 5 on the south, and 3 on the west. And the actual Mishnah in Masechet Midot tells us there were 38 cells, 5 in the north, 5 in the south, and 3 in the west. In the north and the south, there were 5 above 5, with 5 above them. That is to say, 3 levels of 5. In the west, there were 3 above 3, with 2 above them. And as difficult as this sounds, it's going to get just a little bit more difficult before we begin to understand. Now, we have an illustration here that we have to look at again as far as the levels of cells are concerned. Maimonides continues and tells us there were 3 levels of cells, one level above the other. Here we see that very clearly. Thus, there were 15 cells on the south, 5 above 5, with 5 above them, as we see here. Similarly, in the north, there were 15 cells. There were 8 cells in the west, 3 above 3, with 2 above them on one level. Thus, there were a total of 38 cells. And this is the concept of the ta'im. We're going to be learning about possible purposes of these chambers. And I say possible because this, again, is something which is, there is some controversy about exactly what these spaces were used for. It's difficult to picture exactly what these ta'im looked like, but here we have a pretty good idea from this illustration of the next halakha that Maimonides tells us. He tells us, Shlosha ptachim, this is in halakha Yud Aleph, number 11. We're going to look at these words together with this illustration, several illustrations. Shlosha ptachim hayu lekol echad ve'echad min hata'im. Each cell had 3 entrances, one to the cell on the right of it, another to the cell on the left, and one to the cell above it. So we see, in fact, in this illustration, that each one of these small compartments had an entrance off to the right, another to the left, and another in the ceiling to gain access to the one above that. But then Maimonides tells us, "Uvekeren mizrachit tzfonit bata she baidorta ha'emtzait hayu chamisha ptachim." The cell in the northeast corner of the second story had 5 entrances, not 3, but 5 entrances. One to the cell on its right, one to the cell above it, one to the winding stairwell, one towards the cell with the wickets, which we studied about earlier, and one to the heichal, to the sanctuary. And here he uses that word generally. So, now we have to try and understand exactly what the concept of the levels of the cells is all about, the pattern of the cells. The pattern of the cells in the west differs from the others. And in general, what we are sure of is that the total of all 38 cells were, in fact, used for storage. The question is if they were used for storage of vessels, if they were used for storage of gold and silver that had not been yet utilized for vessels. Again, the source for this entire halakha is really Mishnayot Midot, chapter 4, and Mishnah 7. But the issue is that Maimonides has a radical interpretation from, for example, that of Rashi. Because Rashi would interpret here right and length and left in terms of lengthwise in the row of cells, but according to Maimonides, the expressions that he's using here, right and left, refer actually to the direction of one facing the Holy of Holies, meaning north and south. So we're going to be studying more about these cells. This is one of the more actually difficult concepts in the blueprint of the temple, but also one of the most fascinating. There is no detail in the structure of the temple that has been left untouched by our sages of blessed memory. There is, as you can see and as we've emphasized, a great deal of sometimes controversy regarding the different opinions about exactly how the structure appears. But again, and I would emphasize also in the work of the Temple Institute that today we are creating these plans through the most sophisticated technology available in terms of actual operational blueprints, and once we are necessitated to really try and weigh the opinions against each other to see the validity from an architectural point of view of each one, then we are able to actually come to a working conclusion of how the temple should be built according to this pattern. After all, this is the pattern that Hashem showed us. We have a great deal yet to learn in this chapter. We haven't finished yet of the cells, the winding staircase. What is that all about? Why do we have to gain access to the roof of the sanctuary? What is this for? And I think we can see that rather than pray that the temple should be rebuilt, we must pray that we should merit to rebuild the temple. And in order to do that, we must first understand the words of Maimonides, not like we read earlier that someone wrote that we should pray to be able to look at the temple to understand Maimonides. We have to understand so we can rebuild. That is actually our goal and our obligation, so that we can return the light of the divine presence to the world, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.
Dedications are available for upcoming Light to the Nations teachings. To make a dedication, simply click on the dedication link below the video. Dedications can be made either by check or by credit card via our online form. Add your personal dedication and pick your preferred date. Your dedication will appear as you have designated. In addition, you will receive a personal DVD copy of the show. Your dedications make these productions possible.